There's something I wanted to bring up before we talk about the iconography and the meaning, and that is I like to talk about why so many churches lack it, right? So we talk about secular culture and how we don't find Jesus in Christmas decoration aisles, but many church buildings in the United States don't have iconography. I mean, sometimes maybe you might not find a cross there. And I like to talk about it in part to be fair, because people are really hard on some evangelical Protestant churches for not having iconography. And the idea sometimes seems to be that the reason that you might not see maybe pictures of the nativity or even a cross is because of an attempt to kind of remove even the theology of the cross. And there's really something else going on there. And I want to describe that briefly. If we go back several decades, there was an awareness in America that many Americans were functionally unchurched, had no memory of going to church. And the question is, how do we reach people in America that have become secularized? If we look at missions throughout the world, what did Protestants do that worked? They would go to a place, ask some questions, and questions like the underlying question, how do I reach these people given their culture, right? What language do I use? So you might go to a place and say, what is the architecture of sacred space in this particular culture, in this place? And if we build a church, do we want to build a church so that the native population would look at the church and say, that must be a temple, right? That must be a sacred space. Is there a particular color in this culture, for example, that might be considered sacred or associated with sacred? And then ask the question, should we incorporate this color in the interior or exterior of the church? So that's a question. There's certain style. Language-wise, what's the language of the people? And that can be, basic as far as translation. What language should I use? If they don't know English, what's the native language? But not beyond that, how should I use the language? What analogies might be effective in this particular culture based upon the life of the people? And then artistic aesthetics, that sort of thing. Music, what is the musical tradition? And might we be able to, in some way, take the gospel and put it into musical forms that people can readily understand? So that's an idea of basic mission principle. So the idea was this: can we incorporate that type of mission approach that we use overseas in the United States? So if we go back, we can go back to the 80s and say, okay, if you are unchurched, if you're going to go and listen to someone speak, let's say a motivational speaker, what might you like? Maybe somebody that's going to give you some psychological principles about being successful in life, maybe having a good marriage, how to raise your kids, rubber meets the road, sort of basic principles. If you go somewhere, if you go to a conference or you go to listen to a motivational speaker, what kind of environment would it look like? Well, probably like an auditorium, right? And how would the person be dressed? At a certain time, maybe khakis, button-down shirt, maybe not too formal without a suit and tie. If you were going to listen to music, what kind of music might you listen to? What is popular music that people would listen to anyway? And can we use music like that to some degree in order to communicate what we want to communicate? Sort of like the idea of taking old drinking songs, right, from the pubs and putting Christian theology there. That is how we get a lot of churches that exist today. So the idea was this, though. We'll bring people into an auditorium, and maybe people have a bad view of Christianity. What would they see as a Christian symbol that might turn them off? Well, the cross. Sometimes people don't see the cross in a positive sense. So let's just take the crosses out, and we'll bring people into an environment where we'll use music that has a nice beat and you can dance to it or wave your arms to it or whatever. And we'll give them a speech that is brief, maybe have some video, maybe even movie clips from a movie they might see in the theater or watch on TV. And we can integrate modern entertainment into this sort of very basic principles about how we treat each other right? Love your neighbor, loving God, who God is, God loves you, sort of message. And we get people into this room. And then we'll draw people to this big event. But here's the catch. It's kind of a bait and switch, because what we're going to do is we will offer them opportunities to join small groups during the week. And some of those small groups will be Bible studies and discipleship studies, and maybe opportunities to do service. And what we'll do is, or maybe we will have a city and we'll have these little groups in geographic locations that might do everything. You might try to love people through action and study the Bible and learn about basic Christian belief, this sort of thing. So the idea was that you draw people into a big group, but then those people who might be there for superficial reasons, getting a superficial message, will then be drawn into something where you can learn about the doctrine of the Trinity. You can learn about the incarnation. You can learn about the relationship with the Old Testament and the New Testament and all of this, and get some kind of depth. But what may have happened, though, is that people come to the show and never get any deeper, right? So what you end up with is just kind of mega churches. Some of these churches were conceived, by the way, not as even a church with small groups, but one of the models, it was a church of small groups. So really the idea was that the primary church would be a church where people are praying together and learning together, investing in each other. It's really based on what the church was like at the very beginning after Pentecost in the book of Acts, with all of this clinging to the apostles' teaching and fellowship and prayer, all of this. It didn't turn out that way. And of course, from an Orthodox perspective, there's a limit in the depth that's available there also. And there's also a misunderstanding of Christian worship. For us, the worship it teaches, the worship space teaches through the iconography and everything. It was kind of an experiment and went off into like postmodern worship and a lot of different things. And I actually went to a church once that supposedly was doing this kind of postmodern worship. And it is one of those things that probably helped me realize how contrived and fake it was. This attempt to connect to ancient Christianity by having candles, even though you had screens and a big band up there, as well as the fact that I ended up in a Protestant church I went there, and probably because they had a very basic sort of liturgy in the gym, and I ended up in the most conservative, historic, for this church, the most historic version of Christian worship that they had available by the end. And I found the Orthodox church during this time. So I always like to talk about that. We look at these churches and it looks like they're trying to take Jesus out, and there was something deeper than that. And I'll mention, even in historic Methodism, there was an attempt to bring people to bigger group meetings, these society meetings. But ultimately, the idea was to get people in what are called classes, which are smaller, deeper, supposed to be deeper theological groups. And then even beyond that, even deeper groups beyond that. So there's supposed to be sort of like, you think about an inverted triangle, people being filtered down like a funnel and into a depth of Christian teaching and experience. But we often don't see that. And from an Orthodox perspective, I think a fundamental problem is, first of all, you can try to borrow Christian symbols from the ancient church and parts of Christian teaching from the ancient church. But what you really need is just to enter into the fullness of the ancient church, right? From the very beginning. Just come in. It's like drinking from the fire hose. I don't know how many people have seen UHF, but it's like drinking from the fire hose, just this fullness of theology coming at you and kind of being blown over, and that's okay. But all of the iconography, being faced with that, all of the hymnography, all of the maximalism that everything that the historic ancient church that is alive to 2,000 years later has to offer, drinking from that fountain of being shaped by it and immersed in it is really what we need. And that's the short answer, by the way.